Someday we'll get paid for this.
Last month, a highly disturbing incident took place in Orlando, Florida. 27-year-old Ibragim Todashev, a Chechen man apparently acquainted with one of the men accused of the Boston bombings, was killed in his home by the FBI during questioning. Since that time, the FBI has fed media outlets a steady diet of conflicting information, one that has made an ugly incident look all the more repugnant and suspicious. Welcome to Collateral.
There were 4 or 5 of them, all armed. He didn't pose any threat to them, but even if he threatened them with his fists, couldn't they shoot his leg? My son couldn't attack them because he's not crazy. I don't know how they could shoot him like that.
The FBI's shifting event narrative has been well documented by several smaller media outlets, including the Atlantic Wire, the Rachel Maddow Show, and the Orlando Sentinel, which has done a lot of the original reporting on this.
This morning calls for an independent investigation into the shooting death of a man by the FBI agents.
And we now know the suspect, Ibragim Todashev, was not holding a weapon when he was shot.
The result thus far has been to create an account that departs in key respects from the original story presented. The first reports on May 22nd, attributed to 3 of the officials present, had Todashev lunging at an FBI agent with a knife, who then shot him. However, another story later that same day claimed that the shooter may not have been the FBI agent, but one of the others at the scene. Apparently, 2 of the 3 officials who originally saw Todashev lunging with a knife were now unsure of what had happened. A few days later, on May 25th, citing other officials briefed on the matter, the Boston Globe reported that it was the FBI agent who fired the, quote, shot or shots, unquote. The same story mentioned a neighbor of Todashev's who heard, quote, loud bangs, plural, when the killing occurred. Now, a day prior to this, Todashev's father held a press conference where he claimed to have pictures of his son taken by Todashev's friend, Kuzin Tamarov, who was also questioned on several occasions by the FBI, including during the evening Todashev was killed.
These photos show Ibragim Todashev after he was shot and killed by an FBI agent during an interview in Florida. U.S. officials say Todashev attacked the agent, but his father doesn't believe it. He says the photos show he was shot 7 times, including once in the head.
Then, in a report on May 29th, FBI sources were saying that Todashev was unarmed when he was shot and killed.
They all insist that Todashev was unarmed inside that apartment, and the only possible weapon aside from the guns those 3 agents inside the apartment had was a decorative sword, but that sword, according to law enforcement sources, had been moved away prior to questioning.
In the Washington Post version of the news story, the other officials had stepped out of the room at this time, leaving the FBI agent alone with Todashev before he lunged. The article also mentioned that Todashev was just about to sign a confession to an unsolved and very strange killing that had taken place in 2011 in Boston, one that implicated both Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the elder bombing suspect, and Todashev. Now, if all of that weren't enough, recall that the original reports had at least 5 officials present at Todashev's shooting. But by May 31st, several major news outlets were curiously accepting of the FBI's new claim that there had only been 3 officials present during the questioning. 2 of the officials, apparently, had now disappeared. There are other discrepancies in the story than these, but we leave the matter here. While some of the story changing is understandable given the circumstances, other aspects of it plainly are not, and reek of an effort to manipulate the event narrative in favor of law enforcement. Todashev, it should be noted, had not been charged with any crime. He had not been implicated in the Boston bombings, nor was he believed to hold the so-called extremist views of the suspected bombers. No. The FBI's dogged questioning of Todashev on this occasion and several previous ones had been linked to his alleged participation in that very odd triple murder referenced earlier, one that occurred on the 10th anniversary of September 11th in Boston. On that day, 3 young men were brutally murdered, their throats cut, and marijuana poured all over their dead bodies.
It does look like the assailants and the decedents did know each other. We have no evidence of a break in the apartment, and we have other indicia that the decedents and the assailants were known to each other.
It turns out that Tamerlan Tsarnaev, one of the Boston bombing suspects, was a friend of one of the men murdered that day in 2011. The FBI contends its questioning of Todashev was in relation to that murder, and crucially, that Todashev was about to confess just before he allegedly freaked out, requiring that the agent kill him. Now, Tsarnaev and Todashev may have been guilty of the earlier murders, we don't know. But even one suspicious of the FBI might ask, aside from closing a formerly cold case, what does the FBI have to gain from implicating Tsarnaev in these earlier murders when the bombings would have been sufficient to put him in prison forever? Well, one can't say what secret motives the FBI might have for such things, but what can be said is that if the FBI was trying to frame these young men for the 2011 Boston murders, it wouldn't be the first time it had framed innocent men for murders committed in Boston, and not by a long shot. The FBI has an unfortunate and long-running criminal history of framing innocent men for murders committed in Boston. In 2007, Judge Nancy Gertner awarded more than $100 million to Peter Limon and Joseph Salvati for the FBI's willful prosecution of them when they knew them to be innocent of a murder the FBI set them up for 4 decades before. They sat in jail for nearly 40 years, did these men, and been placed on death row for the murder of a man killed by a prized and psychopathic FBI informant, Joe Barboza. Rather than lose Barboza as an informant, the FBI decided to frame these guys and steal the majority of their adult lives. This wasn't a one-off either. Virtually the entire federal criminal justice system was implicated in this criminal sham. For instance, U.S. Attorney and then federal judge Edward Harrington participated in the frame-up. His successor, Jeremiah O'Sullivan, head of the U.S. Attorney's Organized Crime Strike Force, protected mobster Whitey Bulger during his monstrous run of murder and mayhem during the 1970s and beyond. The FBI at that time was so closely imbricated with organized crime in Boston that crime historians now believe that FBI agents not only supplied information to their gangland buddies against other criminals, but may have taken part in gangland executions themselves. And so today, we have the extraordinarily strange death of Ibragim Todashev, a young Muslim man killed during questioning in his own home by an FBI agent. The FBI's Islamophobia has been well documented. Both Todashev's family and the Council for American-Islamic Relations have called for an independent investigation of Todashev's killing, and they've now been joined by the ACLU in that call. The unfortunate fact is, the FBI has a long record of breaking up terror plots involving Muslim men that the agency itself has helped organize in the first place. And therefore, there's no reason whatsoever to believe its story about what 2 Muslim men may or may not have been up to without a full and complete investigation of the agency's role in these events.
He's been trying to give us more information as he knew, which wasn't a lot actually. He didn't know that well, the brothers Tsarnaev. He just knew them who they are, but that's it. And he didn't try to hide anything because it was nothing to hide.